Emma sank into the soft couch cushions of her apartment, letting out a long sigh as she rubbed her temples. The stress from work had been relentless all week, and tonight she just wanted to relax. Her best friend, Sophie, perched on the armrest beside her, scrolling through her phone with that mischievous glint in her eyes. "You know what would make this night way more fun?" Sophie said, looking up. "A massage. Like, a real professional one. Right here." Emma raised an eyebrow, a small smile forming despite herself. "A massage? At my place?" she asked, trying to sound casual but feeling a flutter of curiosity. Sophie nodded enthusiastically, already dialing her phone. "Yeah, I know a guy, Mark. He's great, totally professional, and, well, let's just say he's easy on the eyes." Emma laughed nervously, but before she could argue, Sophie was done talking and hung up. "He's on his way," she said with a grin, bouncing slightly on the couch. Emma felt a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. She had always been curious about stepping outside her comfort zone, but inviting a stranger into her home felt daring. A soft knock at the door pulled Emma from her thoughts. Sophie jumped up immediately, swinging the door open to reveal Mark standing there. He was taller than she expected, with broad shoulders and a calm, confident presence. He smiled politely, holding a small bag of supplies. "Hi, I'm Mark. I'll just set up over there," he said, pointing to the corner of the living room. Emma felt her pulse quicken as he moved with ease, setting up a massage table and arranging oils and towels. Sophie nudged her playfully. "See, totally normal, totally professional." The massage began gently, Mark's hands firm but careful on Emma's shoulders and back. The room was filled with the soft scent of lavender and the faint sound of calming music playing from a small speaker. Emma felt herself relaxing, letting go of tension she hadn't realized had been coiled in her muscles. Sophie sat back on the couch, watching with a mix of curiosity and amusement, occasionally glancing at Emma's reactions. At first, everything felt perfectly professional, but subtle things began to shift. Mark's fingers lingered slightly longer in certain spots, and there was a warmth in his touch that made Emma's skin tingle. She told herself it was normal, that muscles needed attention, yet she couldn't ignore the small spark of something else, something more intimate. Sophie noticed too, though she didn't intervene. "Relax," she whispered teasingly, "let him do his thing." Emma shot her a quick look, a mix of gratitude and mild embarrassment. Sophie just smirked, clearly enjoying the subtle tension that was building in the room. As the massage continued, Emma's mind wandered. She felt a strange mix of guilt and excitement, thinking about how this situation was unfolding. Her body was responding to Mark's touch in ways she hadn't anticipated, and part of her was both thrilled and scared by the sensation. Sophie's presence, light and teasing, only amplified the tension. Mark's hands moved skillfully, working out the tight knots along Emma's back. "Just breathe," he said softly, his voice low and soothing. Emma obeyed, letting the rhythm of the massage and the calm tone of his words take over. There was something almost magnetic about his presence, the way he seemed to know exactly how to ease her body without being too intrusive. Time seemed to stretch in the dimly lit room. Emma became hyper-aware of every movement, every brush of his fingers across her skin. She tried to focus on the relaxation, on the idea that this was just a massage, but her thoughts kept drifting. Sophie's occasional teasing remarks, innocent yet charged with implication, added to the mix, creating a complicated swirl of emotions inside her. By the end of the session, Emma felt both lighter and heavier at the same time, relieved from the physical tension but burdened by an unexpected inner conflict. There was no outward change, no dramatic event, yet the dynamic in the room had subtly shifted. Something unspoken had begun between her, Sophie, and Mark, a tension that neither of them could ignore. Emma sat up slowly, smoothing her hair back, trying to regain composure. Sophie gave her a knowing look, and Mark smiled politely as he packed his things. It was a simple evening on the surface, but beneath it, something fragile and dangerous had already taken root. Emma knew that tonight would not remain just a story about a casual massage. Something had changed, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face what came next. Emma couldn't shake the lingering warmth of Mark's touch as she tidied the living room after he left. Sophie lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone but glancing at Emma every few seconds, clearly amused by her friend's distracted state. "You're quiet," Sophie said, finally breaking the silence. "Thinking about him." Emma flushed but didn't answer immediately. The thought made her uneasy, yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt. Something about Mark's presence lingered in her mind, a magnetic energy she hadn't anticipated. Sophie leaned forward, her smirk playful. Come on, admit it, you felt it too. Emma shook her head, trying to dismiss it. It's just a massage, Soph. I mean, nothing happened. Yet, even as she said it, her mind replayed the lingering pressure of Mark's hands, the way he seemed to sense every knot, every tension, as if he could read her body. Sophie's teasing continued, leaning closer now. Sure, nothing happened, but I've seen the way you reacted. Don't lie to me. She tapped her finger on the coffee table, eyes gleaming. Sometimes, you've got to let yourself feel things. It's not like anyone's hurt. Emma felt a shiver run through her, a mixture of excitement and guilt. She wanted to tell herself Sophie was right, that curiosity and attraction weren't crimes, but there was a whisper of caution in her mind. Still, the idea of stepping further into this unknown, dangerous space made her pulse quicken. Later, Mark returned for a follow-up massage. This time, the atmosphere was heavier, charged with anticipation. The dim lights, soft music, and faint lavender scent all seemed more intimate now. Emma's heart beat faster as he set up, his movements smooth and confident. Sophie sat back, a small grin tugging at her lips, clearly enjoying the tension that hung in the room. From the start, Mark's approach was slightly different, his hands warmer, more deliberate, lingering in places that made Emma acutely aware of her body. She told herself it was professional, that he knew how to provide a better massage, but her thoughts betrayed her. Every brush of his fingers sent sparks of sensation she hadn't expected. Sophie leaned over once, whispering softly, "Relax, just let it happen." Emma glanced at her friend, conflicted, sensing Sophie's encouragement was both playful and provocative. It was as if Sophie wanted to see how far Emma would go, teasing out emotions she herself had kept hidden. Emma tried to focus on breathing, on the sensation of relief in her muscles, but the attraction she felt toward Mark was undeniable. Every glance, every subtle shift of his hands, every low murmur of his voice felt electric. Her mind raced with questions, desire, and guilt, tangled together in a confusing knot. Mark noticed her hesitation. He paused, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said quietly, his voice warm, almost intimate. "Just breathe and relax. No pressure." Emma's chest tightened, the tone of his words, the sincerity mixed with subtle charm, made her heart thrum in ways she wasn't prepared for. Sophie leaned back, letting the silence stretch, her smirk never fading. Emma felt the dual weight of Sophie's playful encouragement and Mark's quiet attentiveness pressing down on her, forcing her to confront feelings she had tried to ignore. Part of her wanted to stop, to retreat to the safety of rational thought, but another part, a daring, curious part, was drawn irresistibly forward. As the session went on, Emma felt herself crossing a threshold, the professional boundary between client and therapist beginning to blur. Mark's touch was gentle but purposeful, each movement calculated to ease tension and simultaneously provoke awareness. She realized she was caught in a web of emotion, attraction, and guilt, each thread pulling her in a direction she hadn't planned to go. By the end of the massage, Emma was drained yet exhilarated, aware that something irreversible had started to form. Sophie watched her, eyes glinting with unspoken questions, daring her to acknowledge what had changed. Emma felt a mix of excitement, shame, and anticipation, knowing that the next encounter would either push her further into temptation or force her to confront the consequences of her curiosity. As Mark packed his things to leave, he offered her a lingering smile that hinted at the unspoken tension between them. Emma's heart raced, aware that the dynamics in the room had shifted completely. She was no longer just a client, she was part of a delicate triangle of emotions, desire, and moral complexity. Sophie stood, clapping softly. "Well, that was interesting," she said, her tone teasing but knowing. Emma forced a small laugh, feeling the weight of what was happening settle in her chest. Something had begun tonight, subtle but undeniable, and she knew that stepping forward or pulling back would define everything that followed. The following evening, Emma felt a nervous anticipation as she waited for Mark to arrive. She could still feel the memory of his hands on her skin, the warmth, the subtle tension that had lingered even after he left. Sophie leaned back on the couch, her eyes gleaming with that familiar mix of mischief and curiosity. "Are you ready this time?" she asked, her voice low and teasing. Emma hesitated, biting her lip, aware that she was standing at a threshold she hadn't crossed before. When Mark stepped through the door, the air shifted immediately. He carried himself with the same quiet confidence, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Evening, Emma," he said softly, setting down his bag. His gaze lingered just a moment longer than necessary, and Emma's stomach fluttered. She reminded herself to breathe, to focus, but every instinct in her body was alert, aware, ready. The massage began with the familiar motions, slow and deliberate. Mark's hands glided over her shoulders and back with practiced skill, easing tension while sending subtle signals she couldn't ignore. Emma tried to ground herself in the professional aspect, telling herself it was just relief from stress, but the attraction that had been building was impossible to deny. Sophie's presence was both a comfort and a provocation. She lounged casually on the couch, occasionally leaning forward to whisper, "Just let yourself feel it. No one's judging." Her words sent a shiver down Emma's spine. Sophie's encouragement, playful yet knowing, made the tension between Emma and Mark feel electric. Mark paused for a moment, resting his hands lightly on Emma's lower back. "You've been carrying a lot of tension," he murmured, his voice low and warm. Emma's breath hitched. There was an intimacy in his tone, a subtle closeness that made her heart race. She knew the boundary between professional and personal was thinning, and the awareness both frightened and thrilled her. The room seemed smaller somehow, the dim lighting wrapping them in a cocoon of shadow and sound. Every movement, every touch, was amplified in her mind. Emma could feel the pull of temptation, a magnetic force drawing her closer to something she had never allowed herself to experience before. Sophie watched silently, her smirk telling Emma that she understood the unspoken rules of this game. Mark's hands lingered, and Emma felt herself leaning into the sensation, the hesitation melting away under the warmth and careful pressure. She realized, almost with shock, that she was giving herself over to the moment, allowing desire and curiosity to override caution. Guilt flickered briefly at the edge of her mind, but it was quickly drowned out by the thrill of surrendering, if only for a moment, to what she felt. Sophie's whispered encouragements punctuated the silence. "It's okay, just let it happen." Emma's heart raced faster. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, a fragile thread connecting her, Mark, and the unspoken understanding Sophie had cultivated between them. Every small gesture, every subtle glance, carried weight. Emma's senses were heightened, and she was acutely aware of how dangerously close they were to crossing an invisible line. Mark's touch became more intentional, exploring with a delicate precision that left no part of her unaffected. Emma's body responded, a mix of pleasure and guilt intertwining in a confusing swirl. She closed her eyes, letting herself be enveloped by the sensation, by the closeness, by the electricity of the moment. Sophie's quiet presence reinforced the danger, the thrill, the uncharted territory she was now treading. The session reached a point where words were unnecessary. Every look, every movement, communicated the tension between them. Emma knew that what was happening was a departure from innocence, a crossing of boundaries that could never be fully undone. Yet, in that moment, it felt like an awakening, an exploration of desires she had kept hidden even from herself. When Mark finally stepped back, the silence was heavy, almost oppressive. Emma's chest heaved, a mixture of exhilaration and guilt settling deep inside her. Sophie rose, clapping softly, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Well, that was something," she said lightly, though there was a knowing edge to her tone. Emma forced a small laugh, trying to regain composure. She felt changed, aware that the events of the evening had altered her perspective in ways she hadn't anticipated. The guilt was real, the thrill undeniable, and the question of what would come next lingered in her mind like a shadow. As Mark packed his things to leave, his gaze lingered on Emma once more, hinting at the unspoken tension that now existed between them. Sophie followed him to the door, waving him off casually, but the look she gave Emma told a story of shared complicity. Alone, Emma sank onto the couch, the weight of what had transpired pressing down on her. She knew the next steps would be the hardest, facing the consequences of desire, curiosity, and the fragile line between right and wrong. The next morning, Emma woke with a heaviness in her chest. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind, each memory stirring a mixture of guilt and lingering excitement. She stared at the ceiling, unsure if she should feel ashamed or exhilarated, or both. Sophie was already up, making coffee in the kitchen, humming softly, the carefree tone of her movements a sharp contrast to Emma's tangled thoughts. "Morning," Sophie said cheerfully, noticing Emma's silence. "You okay? You look contemplative." Emma gave a small, uncertain smile, trying to push down the emotions that threatened to spill over. "Yeah, I'm fine," she lied softly, though even to herself it didn't feel convincing. Sophie came over and sat beside her, lowering her voice. "Last night was intense, huh?" Emma nodded, feeling the weight of her friend's knowing glance. Sophie's smirk carried a challenge, almost daring Emma to admit the truth of her feelings. Emma shifted uncomfortably, realizing how complicated everything had become, not just her feelings for Mark, but the shifting dynamic with Sophie. Throughout the day, Emma found herself replaying every detail in her mind: Mark's touch, the warmth in his voice, the way Sophie had subtly encouraged her. Each memory left a lingering ache, a mixture of longing and regret that she couldn't shake. She tried to focus on work, on normal life, but the memory of the previous nights clung to her like a shadow. By evening, Emma felt a quiet determination to confront her own emotions. She called Sophie into the living room, where the soft light from the lamp cast gentle shadows across the room. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt. Sophie leaned back casually, but her eyes were sharp, waiting. "About what?" she asked, feigning innocence, though Emma could see the knowing spark in her gaze. Emma took a deep breath. "About last night, about us, and Mark." Sophie's smirk softened slightly, but she didn't look away. "I think we both know this has changed things," Emma continued. "I don't know where I stand, and I don't know what this means for us." There was a pause as the words settled in the quiet room, the tension heavy but unspoken. Sophie reached out, placing a hand on Emma's arm, a small gesture of reassurance. "Hey," she said softly, "whatever happens, we'll figure it out. But you can't ignore how you feel. Don't beat yourself up over desire, it's human." Her words were comforting yet complicated, reinforcing the messy reality of what had happened. Emma nodded, feeling the truth in them, but also the weight of responsibility that came with her choices. Days passed, and the after-effects of those nights lingered. Emma found herself thinking about Mark constantly, the line between excitement and guilt blurring more each day. She realized that attraction wasn't inherently wrong, but secrecy and temptation had consequences. Every text, every thought, carried the weight of decisions she could not undo. Sophie remained a constant, her presence both playful and grounding, a reminder that friendships could survive tension but also be tested by desire. Emma made a choice to take control of her emotions rather than letting them control her. She began to set boundaries, reflecting on her relationship with Sophie and the fleeting yet powerful connection with Mark. It wasn't easy. Temptation still whispered at the edges of her mind, and the memory of the massages lingered in her senses. But she recognized the importance of understanding herself, her desires, and the consequences of indulgence. One evening, Emma sat alone in the apartment, soft music playing in the background, and reflected quietly. She realized that what had happened was not simply about attraction or desire, it was about curiosity, the human tendency to seek connection, and the complexity of moral choices. She understood that her life would never be the same, that trust, friendship, and personal boundaries had been tested, but also that growth often comes from discomfort and reflection. When Sophie came in later, Emma felt a quiet gratitude. They shared a moment of understanding, a subtle acknowledgement that things had changed, but not broken. The events of the past nights would remain a secret thread in their lives, a tension and memory that shaped who they were, how they felt, and how they would navigate desire and friendship in the future. Emma realized that temptation and infidelity were not just about physicality, they were about choices, self-awareness, and emotional honesty. She had crossed a line, felt the thrill, experienced the guilt, and emerged with a deeper understanding of herself. And though the memories of Mark would linger, Emma knew she had reclaimed her agency, deciding how to move forward with clarity, responsibility, and an awareness of the fragile, human heart. In the quiet of the apartment, with shadows stretching across the walls and the soft hum of the city outside, Emma exhaled. The storm of desire had passed, leaving reflection and understanding in its wake.
She knew there would be future temptations, future choices, but she felt prepared to meet them with awareness, honesty, and the courage to confront the consequences of the heart's unpredictable yearnings.